shuffling, you and I, to the church we'll swiftly steal. Then our wedding bells will peal. You can go as far as you like with me in my merry Oldsmobile.
That's not the last time you're going to hear that song, so just get used to it. In 1901, the old ways were in their twilight, and the dawn of a new era was soon on its way. Within a few short years, the carriage makers, farriers, blacksmiths, and wheelwrights would be out of jobs. The sound of horse hooves and metal rims would slowly fade away, and the smell of horses would become more and more novel. As if overnight, millions of people rejected the way that they have moved about for thousands of years, and the horse had lost its throne in one of the most extraordinary coups in the history of mankind. In terms of technical progress, change like this happened in an instant. But in my opinion, this change in thought and in action happened with one product, the Oldsmobile Curved Dash. Now, I know that's a pretty bold claim to hear, but let me explain to you what life was like in 1901, the year the Curved Dash was introduced. Most people either walked, rode a horse or buggy, or rode the train to get literally anywhere. Most Americans never went more than 20 or 30 miles from the place that they were born in. Driving by car was an almost non existent sight, and a cross country trip had not yet been completed. But it had been attempted, and it wouldn't be until 1903 that someone would succeed, and the trip would take 63 days. And when a car was seen, it was a pretty large spectacle. People would crowd the vehicle, jump on it, and ask questions, and many would secretly hope that the thing would fail. And to be fair, many times the car did fail. Cars were expensive and generally unreliable, and it's not like today when your 6.2 liter blows up that you can take it down to the dealership and get it fixed kinda quickly. No, if the car broke at this time, you either had to fix it yourself or send it to the factory for repairs, assuming the company was still in business. In short, in 1901, if you told someone that cars would overtake the horse in less than 20 years, they would have laughed at you. But the Curved Dash would change all of that. But before the Curved Dash and the Oldsmobile, and even the car itself, we gotta go way back to ancient times, 1864. And a new child was being born right in the middle of the US Civil War, a baby named Ransom Eli Olds. Not a whole lot about Ransom's early life is known or worth mentioning, but like his contemporary Henry Ford, Ransom would take an interest in machines and would become a member of his dad's machine shop in 1884, and shortly after would begin manufacturing steam engines and gasoline engines. Ransom, during this time, like many mechanically inclined people of his day, would take an interest in automobiles. His first car was a steam car and was reportedly built sometime around 1887. The car was 2 horsepower and was so underpowered that it could not overcome the grade leaving the shop to test drive it, and had to be pushed before it could run down the street. There were a few more prototypes and apparently a car he made that was bound for India but sunk before it arrived. All while these experiments are going on, Ransom and the engine company that he now controls is gaining traction and sales. But this doesn't stop him from wanting to build a full-fledged production car. Look, I'm not going to go into every detail, but the short story is that while Ransom's engine company is bringing in a lot of money, it will require huge sums of money to assemble a car en masse. A lot more than he has, so he gains investor support to form a company that will continue to sell cars and their engines. Around 1897 to 1899, Olds would sell a token amount of these double-decker, double-wide contraptions, but they were too expensive, they were not making the company money. Oh, and a new name would be used for the first time. Quote, Oldsmobile. The year is now 1900. Ransom, after a quote, long sleepless night, decided to switch gears. Olds was no longer going to make the strange, large vehicles that they had been making up to this point. It would now focus on a small runabout. So he went to one of his engineers, a man named Horace Lumens, and drew a sketch for him and said, "This is what we're going to make. A light, small car for under $700. Along with Lumens, there were a few other involved, one named Milton Beck and Jonathan Maxwell, the man who had already designed one of the first cars in America, Elwood Haynes' quote-unquote pioneer in 1894, and would later have a car bearing his own name called the Maxwell, which would eventually form the roots of Chrysler Corporation. The history of who did what is kinda hard to track, but apparently Beck designed the engine and Maxwell designed the transmission, although he might have designed most of the car depending on who you ask. But the facts generally agree that by late 1900, the prototype was complete for 1901. Two major things would happen for Oldsmobile in 1901: disaster and salvation. Disaster would come on March 9th, 1901, when a fire would break out in the factory. There was chaos and carbonic acid tanks exploding. A factory full of machines, grease, and chemicals was ablaze, and everything the company had made up to this point was at risk of going up in flames. And within an hour, the factory was toast and beyond saving. But during the fire, employees were seen pulling out a single car from the fire, an undamaged prototype, a tiny runabout, the Curved Dash. And not only was the car saved, but the plans to build it were saved as well. This is a fun story, albeit a little bit of a dark one, and it's been told for decades, but it's only partially true. There was a fire, it did destroy the factory, and it is possible that a single prototype was saved, but the Curved Dash was being advertised before the fire. It was already on sale, so fire or not, the world was getting the Curved Dash. Did this fire prevent Olds from having more models on sale? Maybe. But salvation, of course, would come from the Curved Dash. The car was known internally under a few names: the Model R, the Model 6C, and the Model B. And in advertising, the car was usually known simply as the quote, standard runabout for most of its life. The name Curved Dash was an informal name that came from the front shape. Dash, as in short for dashboard, is a term that comes from the horse carriage days. A dashboard was placed on the front of people riding in the carriages to prevent mud and poop and dirt and whatever else from being, quote, dashed up into the occupants' faces. Since the dashboard on this car was curved, that's what people called it. And if the curved dash was too wild, you could order it with a straight dash. The car is a little more than a frame with wheels. It's powered by a single cylinder engine out the back, making 4.5-ish horsepower. Given the fact that the car doesn't have a back seat or roof or doors, it was pretty light, weighing around half a ton, depending on who you asked and what model. Does that mean it's fast? No, absolutely not. Top speed was around 20 miles an hour on a flat surface. Brakes were basically non existent. The first models had brakes on the transmission, but would change in later years to drum brakes on the back. The transmission was a 2-speed planetary, and you steered by the use of a tiller instead of a steering wheel. You also got reverse. Nice. And if you were a real fancy guy, you could even buy a car with a top. And two itty bitty kerosene lanterns came with the car too. Given its Spartan nature, you might be surprised to know that the Curved Dash was one of the first, or not the first, cars to have a speedometer installed on it, which is pretty neat. But aside from the speedometer, there really isn't anything unique going on here. There were plenty of one-cylinder runabouts being made at this point in time, plenty of cheap cars too. But what this car could be is what other cars couldn't be, and that was a good and cheap car. The Curved Dash was cheap. $650, a price that the car would have for its entire life, aside from the first year. To put this into perspective, this was roughly $250 cheaper than the first Ford Model T. But it wasn't just cheap, it was well made and well designed, and would include components from some of the finest manufacturers of the day, including engines and transmissions from the Dodge brothers, I wonder what they did later, and Leland and Faulkner. The second company is interesting because ahead of it, Henry Leland would soon go on to form the Cadillac Motor Company after Ford's first company failed. So the car is cheap, but it was also tough as hell. Olds would run various trials to show just how viable this car would be. For the 1901 auto show in New York, a Curved Dash would be driven to the show from Detroit. It was an 800-something mile trip that took 7 days to complete. The man driving the car was Roy D. Chapin, who would later found the Hudson Motor Car Company. And to prove that this car really was the toughest little car, Olds would stage an exhibition race across America. Two Curved Dashes, one named the Old Scout and the other named Old Steady, would drive across the American continent from New York to Portland, a grueling drive that would cover barely paved roads, washed out bridges, mud, sand, and anything else you can name. At one point, the roads were so dangerous that old Scout's brakes had failed while trying to navigate down a mountain. A co-driver had to drag himself behind the car for over 7 miles to slow the runabout down till it reached the bottom. There were a few breakdowns and a few accidents, but the Curved Dash made it to Portland in 44 days, 3 hours, and 28 minutes. It took almost 20 days less to cross the country than the trip taken 2 years prior by Horatio Nelson Jackson in his Winton. It's pretty impressive from a car that looks like a quote jalopy, according to my sister. And another point worth bringing up for why this car was so successful was that the Olds actually could build the cars. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were plenty of automaker wannabes who could promise the world a stylish car that was cheap and would be available in the next couple of months. But a lot of these companies were either pure vaporware or they didn't really know how to make cars in mass. Olds was probably the first company to assemble cars with an assembly line. Before the assembly line, cars would be placed onto a stand and components would be brought to the stationary car one at a time. The workers would then piece whatever parts on the car together that needed to be put on next. There wasn't really specialization that we think of today. Like there wasn't a man whose job it was to put on the headlights and another to do the seats. The process was slow, but at the same time, optimized for the low output of the day. It was far cheaper to form an automaker this way, and that's one reason why there were literally hundreds of car makers in those early years. But this system couldn't handle volume well and struggled with economics of scale, which is why Olds, in order to keep up with the enormous demand for the Curved Dash, would pioneer a system where the cars would be placed onto a rolling platform and taken from station to station, where workers who had specific parts with specific jobs would assemble the car. It wasn't the mechanical nightmare that would define auto production a few years later, but it was an assembly line, and it worked. Production would jump from around 400 cars in 1901 to around 4,000 in 1902. Now, granted, there was a fire in 1901, but by 1903, Olds had produced as much as 40% of all American cars within that year. By the end of 1907, production was over 19,000 cars. Not crazy numbers, I know, but enough to be the best selling cars during its heyday and enough to show financiers that the automobile was a viable investment. You remember that song at the beginning of the video? Well, the Curved Dash was also a cultural hit in its day. In 1905, Gus Edwards and Vincent Bryan would make the song called In My Merry Oldsmobile, which was a song about a couple doing couple things in an Oldsmobile. The song would be played for decades after in marketing and covered by other musicians. But by 1907, the end had come, great soundtrack or not. In 1906, Ford had introduced their Model N, which would go on to be the best-selling car when it came out. It was 4 cylinders, had 15 horsepower, and cost $150 less than Olds. Soon enough, the little runabout was looking a little dated and a little expensive. Olds over the next few years would sort of lose the plot on what had made them successful initially. Their cars would get bigger and more expensive. The perfect example of this was the Oldsmobile Limited, an enormous car with a massive engine and 2 levels of running boards. Olds, of course, would become part of General Motors and never really was the same after. Not necessarily that it was a bad thing, but the philosophy of a light, affordable runabout was gone. Do I think that the automobile was going to come with or without the Curved Dash? Yes, no doubt. But the Curved Dash really was the first major hit of the industry, and at least from America's perspective, the car was massively influential in people's minds. It bridged the gap between the horseless carriage days and the automobile days. It was lightweight, easy to understand, and I imagine changed the minds of everyone who saw it at work. Is it the Ford Model T? No. The Model T changed life itself for everyone. Literally everyone. But this is still a very important fact of automotive history, and I'm happy to share it.